Welcome. Thank you all for joining the API 201 webinar today, where we'll be taking a closer look at maximizing APIs for secure information exchange. First, before we get started, let's have a few logistical reminders. This is a live session and it's being recorded. Anyone who registered for this event will receive a link to the recording within 24 hours. And while the lines are muted today, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send them in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And we'll do our best to answer your questions during the sessions, but if we don't, we'll get with you later. In case you missed API 101, obviously by using the name API 201, if you missed it, you might want to see what we talked about before. But in the API 101 session, you can still view it on our website. If you just simply scan the QR code and save it for later, it does give a brief introduction to APIs and how they are transforming health IT. And so today we pick up from where we left off. And my name is Dan Rice. I'm product marketing manager here at Rhapsody. I do a lot of focusing on the integration side of our interop suite. And I'm lucky enough to have with me two of our subject matter experts when it relates to integration and APIs as well. Thank you both for joining. Caitlin and Dan, could you give the audience a brief introduction of yourselves?
Sure. Hey everyone, I'm Caitlin Formal. I'm a solution consultant here at Rhapsody. I've worked in the interoperability space for the last decade, in various roles, from implementation to customer support to solution architecting, and now on the sales engineering side. Dan?
Hi everyone, Dan Sabo. I've been with the professional services group now for 19 years on the CorePoint side here at Rhapsody. So my day-to-day has been building interfaces, maybe like a lot of you out there. Looking forward to chatting.
No, thank you both. And kind of talking about a brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. Certainly, we're going to touch on some market drivers, some trends, some things we're hearing from industry experts, just to kind of validate where we're at in APIs and healthcare. But then after that, we're going to get really practical. And thank you again, Dan, for Caitlin and joining, just to get into some everyday real world examples and how we see APIs being used. And by no means can we cover everything. Really, one of the biggest challenges of preparing today is what we could talk about in the short amount of time we have together. And then we'll make some observations and takeaways before we close out today. So why APIs? Where's the value? An interesting article that you can still see from last year on NIH.gov, and the title on the very bottom of the slide, Why APIs, Anticipated Value, Barriers, and Opportunities for APIs. It really goes over some interesting things that I think is foundational for our discussion today. APIs continue to grow, and in this article, they interviewed 12 subject matter experts across the healthcare industry, and they broke it down into all the opportunities they see across different categories, and it somewhat covers the spectrum of patients. Easier for patients to access information. Certainly with smartphones today, we can pull information from our EHR in a number of different ways, administratively accelerating prior authorizations and eligibility expediency. Clinicians, now they start to reach outside the EHR, and our great HCIT partners that we work with today using Rhapsody products and solutions, they can connect more easily, and clinicians can take advantage of those innovations. And then value-based care with better outcomes, public health and the way we interact with immunization data, and quick access to other important demographic blocks of information. And then even social services, the way clinicians can interact with that information for social risk assessments and querying of social services for availability and tracking referrals. That's a mouthful, but it's a really great article, and I think it, again, kind of confirms the direction we see, and we're going in just for, in summary, better total experiences. We actually had a blog post about that recently with APIs. The more data is readily available for use, more efficiencies, maybe it's getting down to manual labor improvements, workflow improvements, accelerating those workflows, and then better collaboration, and again, easier to innovate. And another couple of things that we've talked about before, you may have, if you've read some of our content, you may have seen some of this before, but drivers for API adoption aligns directly with the people using the tools. There is a survey from AMA Digital Health Research talking about the adoption of digital health apps incorporated into physician practices. And over the last several years, we've seen that grow exponentially, some more obvious than others, but in any sense, it's all because it's easier to access that data, it's easier to access those applications. And confirming that is a Gartner recent report that by 2026, 20% of healthcare providers will have shifted away from patient portals that are tethered to the EHR in favor of digital front door solutions for their primary method of digital patient engagement. So this certainly enables our HCIT partners, it enables our provider partners in just making healthcare a better place. But aside from that, I would definitely like to hear from you. So the next few minutes, I'd like to get your feedback on what specific areas related to APIs are top of mind for you. And so, so I don't know if you've used Slido before. It's a tool we use for polling. If you scan that QR code, it will bring you to slido.com, or you can go there yourself. And what I would ask you to do is enter the number at the bottom if you're going there directly by typing in slido.com, and just answer the question. Select which specific area related to APIs is top of mind for you. And we'll see the poll being updated in real time. And yeah, thank you for doing that. And if it's other, certainly we can't touch on everything in 4 or 5 responses. Select other and leave it in the chat, because this is not, API 201 is not the end of us talking about this. We're going to cover these topics again, and potentially an API 301 webinar, other content, blogs, white papers in the future. So yeah, thank you. I'll give it a couple more, few more seconds, and then we'll move on. But certainly it looks like supporting new complex workflows is something that we hear about quite often. And it's just great when we talk about APIs in combination with our integration engines, what that's capable of. So I think you came to the right place, and we're going to cover some of that today. So we have supporting new workflows, 55%, maximizing data access, 31%. No one has left other yet. Again, if you think of something else that's really top of mind for you, leave it in the chat. But that's very helpful. Thank you for providing that input. And what we'll do now is we'll jump right into the content, and I will pass it over to Caitlin and Dan.
Yeah, no, thank you for all that feedback. So I think you came to the right place if you're looking to understand how APIs can help you maximize complex workflows. Dan and I are going to kind of tell the story through the evolution of how we've used APIs in healthcare. I think from our backgrounds, both Dan and I have implemented a lot of interfaces, and so we're kind of going to tell the story through that lens. So when you think about getting a little feedback. When you think about the healthcare ecosystem and how we first started thinking about integrating healthcare data, it was all via very transactional interfaces. It was the data needed to live in both systems, and so we would very event driven, and let's send data from one EHR to another external system. I think as that evolution, when we first started seeing APIs, it was more honestly kind of along that paradigm. And so I think I first encountered working with APIs when I worked with public health systems, and it was specifically for vaccine registries. If you want to go to the next slide, Dan. We're still kind of doing that transactional submission, but instead of getting data from one system and submitting it via just a transactional, putting it on an SFTP server or putting it via HL7, we were actually updating vaccine registries via API, so we could get that real-time feedback instead of doing it in batch files or just kind of a transactional payload. Those are done via like SOAP and REST-based APIs. So as we're going through that, we can use our engines to ingest an HL7 message, map that to the required payload. So in this case, it might be, maybe we're embedding that within a SOAP message, but it's still HL7. But then we're submitting that to a SOAP API, or putting that in a SOAP envelope to submit to a SOAP API, or wrapping it up in HTTP payload and putting that to your REST API. So it allowed us to have like the real-time submission, and on that right-hand side, it also reduced some overhead where I'm sure a lot of you on this call have implemented HL7 interfaces, and they kind of require an RB on both sides to get things set like VPN tunnels. And so we were able to secure these using things like certificates or token-based exchange that we'll talk about a little bit later, to say, you know, I am who I say I am, and do I have access to update this registry? And kind of doing this via APIs, via just HL7 or via SFT batch files, it's really, you know, allowed for a lot more real-time updates, and it's became very prevalent during COVID. So not only can we use APIs just on that right-hand side, so, you know, using that payload, we can also use that to update messages and do some different message enhancement as a message is traversing through the engine. So it's not necessarily left-hand or right-hand side. It can also be done throughout that flow. I think Dan's going to talk about a few examples there.
Yeah. And here we're back to that initial transactional interface with our HL7 in on the left and out on the right. But we're taking a deeper dive into what's happening in the engine here. So we've got some mapping logic here that we're kind of calling out in a generic way. So something that we're doing to map ADTs, and in this case, we have the need to look up provider IDs. So we have some kind of internal table, code set, storage of some kind. Maybe it's an external database, but we are doing a lookup to translate some local identifier for a provider to an NPI for that downstream radiology system. So you can think of this workflow as we have a source of truth. It happens to be a table that we have to maintain. If there are new providers that come along on that inbound feed that we don't have on our table, we have an issue in that destination system needs the NPI. So either we have to throw up an error in the logic of the engine, or the radiology system is going to reject it, and there's going to be an issue. So we think of, again, that our NPI lookup here is our little source of truth. What if you knew? Go ahead and advance, Dan. What if you knew that there is the true source of truth is the National Plan and Provider Enumeration Service. This is the place where providers actually register to get an NPI. So this is straight from the source. Every day, all the new providers are added to this registry, and they happen to have an API, a REST API. It's free. This is kind of, I wanted to start with this example because it's really low overhead to a low bar to get interested and get your feet wet with APIs. Not only is it a free API, it's publicly available. There's actually no security. We'll talk a little bit more about security, but that endpoint is not protected at all because it's just provider data. That's not typical for most APIs. Provider data, so there it's unprotected and anyone can get to it. I built something in the CorePoint engine last night in about 15 minutes to actually retrieve some providers. There are about 15 providers with the last name of Doom, by the way, Dr. Doom. So in the United States. So here we show our logic with our generic ADT mapping again, then our API query for the NPI. So we are interacting with the API right in the middle of our top to bottom logic, and we populate. Once we retrieve the NPI, we may have to handle different cases that responses that come back from that API. Hopefully with a success, we're populating that NPI and off it goes to the RAD system. A couple things to consider though, your database or your local lookup may have been very fast, and introducing a call to an API may introduce more latency than your interface can handle. So if this is a high volume interface or very time critical, the latency, the delay that it would require to get that round trip of request and response back, maybe more than you can use this scenario. And another one is that they may, if you have high volume, I don't know if they do or not, but they may have something called rate limiting enabled on this API, where if you make too many calls over a short enough period of time, they will just start refusing your request with a special response code. So go ahead and Dan to the next advance here. Kind of a hybrid is we're still going to keep our local lookup, but we are only going to check the registry when we no longer, when it's not found in our lookup. So this way we have the benefit of the fast and the source of truth whenever we need it. So this would kind of be a nice hybrid approach. So again, this example and the next one, which we can go ahead and transition. Go ahead, Dan. This next one, it's a very similar looking slide. And in the last slide, we thought of the National Registry of NPIs as the source of truth. Here, when we talk about a semantic layer in our engine or in our environment, the semantics, we're talking about codes, terminology, descriptions for the codes. Sometimes we're mapping from one set of codes to another. Other times, perhaps we're just normalizing the descriptions on a set of codes. So this example is showing an ORM, a lab order, right? Initiated from the EHR going to the lab system on the right. So again, we still have this paradigm of HL7 TCP/IP in, HL7 TCP/IP out. The API interaction, just like in the last case, is about enriching that message along the way. So you'll see that term message enrichment. That's what we were doing with the NPI. Here, with a semantic layer, we're talking about taking a lab code, again, mapping it from one to another, or normalizing the descriptions. Other things that a semantic layer can do are certain codes can be flagged in a special way in that system so that you know if it's a sensitive test that's being performed, that can factor into the logic. When you get that response back from the semantic API, your logic can then do a special change to the message that you're about to send to the lab, whatever that may be for privacy purposes. So again, this is an example of accessing that source of truth. In this case, the semantic layer is our source of truth, our one source of truth for codes and all things code. And we are doing it exactly when we need to do it. So accessing that source of truth in real time when we need it.
And Dan, just to insert in for those that are unfamiliar with semantic and the normalization of codes that you're talking about, that is part of our Rhapsody interoperability suite. So.
Okay, I think the next one we have for Caitlin. Yeah.
Yeah, so just kind of building off what Dan alluded to is that when we interact with APIs, we can interact with those APIs for message enrichment, but we can also update those APIs as part of that process. And so it can be like we can do different recursive calls based on the responses we get back from the data that we receive back from APIs. We can use that to update the message, but we can also use that to take additional actions. So this example here, actually talking about our EMPI, which is also part of our Rhapsody interoperability suite, is I can ingest multiple, so for an EMPI, for those that are not familiar, an EMPI is a master patient index. It's where we can have the source of truth for different patient demographic and other data. This particular use case is taking in different ADT feeds, so different demographic feeds, and then based on and calling the EMPI to say, hey, does this patient actually exist within the EMPI? If it does, I want to actually populate the EUID, that enterprise unique identifier, into my message so I can send that to my downstream systems. So I can know within my ecosystem that, you know, regardless if I came in as Katie Formal or Caitlin Formal or with my married name or my maiden name, that I am who I say I am. Let's grab the EUID, and so I can send that to those downstream systems. If I'm not found in there, I can also interact with that API and say, hey, I actually want to, I'm not there. Let's actually create that patient. Let's generate that EUID so I can put that in my message. So not only can I query that within the same workflow, I can query the EMPI for the information that I need, but I can also update that API as appropriate based on the responses that I receive back from the API. Both our semantic and our AMPI solutions have numerous APIs that you can interact with. So this is just kind of a very basic example of just saying, hey, am I here? If I am here, what's my identifier? If I'm not here, please create me and assign me an identifier. So that's kind of, calling outbound to external APIs and interacting with them. We can also act as the endpoint of different APIs. If you want to click Dan. And that's where we kind of be on that. It's in the left-hand side. It's like, hey, I want to actually receive information back from an API. In this case, the EMPI, I'm actually within the EMPI, there's going to be different events that happen. So maybe I come in with the same local identifier. So I come in as 1, 2, 3, 4 and ABC. I am automatically merged based on the algorithm. I want to make sure I can notify all these downstream systems that if I came in with these different local identifiers, what actually happened. So we can actually subscribe to different notifications from APIs. So we can act as that receiver. So in this case, if it's depending on the event that happens within the EMPI, I'm subscribing to the notifications. And based on those event types, I'm using the engine to map into the appropriate ADT feed because my downstream systems only accept HL7. And so I need, if I'm maybe some of my demographics are updated. I moved, I confirmed those. Let's make an ADT 808. But if it was a merge event, like I just described, I might create an A40 and send those to the downstream systems. So this particular example, when I'm receiving these notifications from my API, from the EMPI API, sorry, a lot of PIs here. This is all within the four walls of my ecosystem. And so I'm only receiving notifications on this endpoint from the MPI. But there are some considerations when I am building an endpoint within my interface engine that I need to consider when I might be receiving receiving calls from multiple external systems, especially over the public internet. If you transition next slide, Dan, or Dan Sabo, if you wanted to add anything there.
No, sorry, go ahead, Caitlin. I think we're good.
Yeah, so when we think about acting as an endpoint within an interface engine, there's a lot of things we need to consider. So again, the previous example was highlighting interacting with data that was just within the four walls of our system. So there's only one consumer. I can easily secure that within my interface engine. However, if we're going to have multiple external consumers of the different API data, or multiple consumers sending data to that endpoint, we really want to think about authentication and authorization. We really want repeatable, auditable, and defendable ways to make sure that we know who is actually calling our APIs, and when they are calling those APIs, that they are who they say they are. So a lot of times you might introduce like an API gateway in between to manage those different types of transactions. So we can do that in a variety of different ways, both within the engine and within the API gateway for things like token-based authentication, OAuth 2, OpenID, setting different time to lives. Let's say, how long can we actually, how long can this particular consumer talk to my different API? And so those are all things that we need to consider when we are having external sources consume our data. So it can also have some implications on when we want to secure how we're actually sending to the outbound side. So on the right-hand side of this diagram. And Dan, if you want to talk about that a little bit.
I can jump in there. So, right, we think of an API gateway as maybe protecting the endpoint that we have stood up in our engine or within our system. So the left side that Caitlin was talking about. There are also use cases where either the security protocol that we need to conform to hit an external endpoint on the right are either challenging or much challenging to do in our engine, or just much more simplified using a gateway, so that has that kind of functionality built into it. So we've seen use cases where it's not just being used to protect our endpoints listening for calls. We're actually inserting the gateway in a flow where we are making the call to an external endpoint, and isn't shown on this diagram here, but you can imagine that API gateway as a pass through, not really a pass through, but as a point where we're sending our request out of the engine to the API gateway. The API gateway is going to take care of an authentication method or some kind of custom scenario that the API on the right hand side would require. Go ahead, Dan, if you want to transition. Okay, so yeah, this one, I saw a comment. Someone made a comment that seems like more and more vendors are offering limited HL7 functionality, but offer APIs to access more data. That's an interesting comment because this was a recent experience of mine, finding that building a bunch of API workflow for this customer, I had to step back and ask him, and this is what we see here on the screen. We were trying to keep two EHRs in sync, right? So it typically, again, back to our transactional, we have transactional on the left. Every ADT event that happens over there in the source partner system, we want to reflect that in our destination EHR on the right. And typically, we would see that as an ADT in and an ADT out. After doing a lot of build for this client, I asked, why are we, given that EHR on the right has the option to receive ADTs, why are we doing all this API work? And the answer was, they made the evaluation that between the cost of, you have to pay for the ADT interface, there's maintenance involved with that ADT interface. They believe that the ADT interfaces are not as recently developed, not as recently maintained by that EHR vendor. And there's also a kind of an upkeep in terms of anytime any change needs to be made, they may have to involve staff from the EHR vendor, which can sometimes be problematic to get that lined up. So for all of those reasons and more, they basically were using the API functionality offered by the EHR to do all the things. This logic just sort of shows a very sparse example of what could be done, but they're doing all the things that the ADT interface provided by the EHR would be doing, and they're doing them within their engine's logic. So querying for the patient, querying for the if the patient exists, keeping the insurance up to date, or if the patient doesn't exist, to create it. Again, just examples. Additional reasons besides cost and maintenance were that's granularity, right? Not only do you get to make decisions along the way based on each of these responses, and perhaps behave in a different way than the ADT interface would, they actually were also interested in notifying certain people for certain conditions. So even if these were not error conditions or scenarios, they could update someone via email from within their engine every time a new patient was created in the destination EMR. That's a useful notification perhaps for these guys. So there were a lot of reasons that kind of coincide with this comment that the HL7 functionality is limited. In this case, they just made the evaluation that it was old and aging, and they went with the API route. And this was new to me, but I think maybe we're going to see more of this. So in this case, just one final parting thought, we have ADT in on the left instead of an ADT out on the right. We are directly manipulating the EHR. So the system that we need to keep in sync, we're doing the direct manipulations with individual API calls. Go ahead, Dan. This is an example. We wanted to get one. So in I think every example that we've covered so far, the initial triggering of the workflow has been some sort of event or message coming inbound into the engine. We wanted to explore this one, which would be scheduled polling, right? So we're showing that this logic is not kicked off by an event coming into the engine, rather on a timer. And for every time this gets kicked off, we have recorded the last time we checked this fire endpoint on the left, and we query for any appointments that have been updated since the last time we checked. So it's a very precise way of getting exactly what you need, lower overhead. We aren't sitting there receiving every SIU all day long, every day. That is what it turns out is required for the destination system. This is a way, maybe you need to do batching and you want everything to go at a certain time of day. Maybe this does need to be more of a real-time flow, so your polling interval is very short and you're checking quite often. However, there are additional advantages to having this ability to go and ask what you want, and it's not just timer based, but you could, in the query, in a fire query, you can ask only for certain appointments that conform to some other criteria. So rather than, maybe this destination system only wants ER appointments. So rather than receive every SIU and filter them out, we're now going and asking for just the ER appointments that have been updated since our last check. So this is an example of, again, another example where we have a source of truth. It's the fire endpoint on the left, and it is where we're going to get our data, but we are choosing exactly when and how to pull the data for our destination system. Go ahead, Dan. Wanted to mention another general topic which sort of enables a lot of new workflows, and that is, a lot of the cloud storage vendors, AWS, Google, and Azure have cloud storage APIs that allow you to access, you're going to see terms like buckets, containers, different methods of that. There are queues, tables, topics. All these have different functionality. You're accessing files, objects. I forgot to put blobs on there, messages. They call them by different names. And you also have things like tags, labels, and metadata that are associated with each of these objects. So while this functionality, you can think of it as replacing a traditional FTP. Maybe we are reading from an FTP server. Some trading partner, the way that they drop files to us is a file system or an FTP server. This would replace that and enable any workflows, similar workflows. However, there are a lot of advantages, right? We have a server that both people have access to via the API, a security method that we didn't have to develop, that we didn't have to, this is Google, this is Azure, everything we know is secure, and we're reading, but we don't just have to read everything in the folder. And that's what if you explore this a bit, you'll see the ability to list all the objects in a container that have a certain tag, and then to be able to update those tags, right? So there's a lot of power in making these API queries to read from the storage, then process however we need to. Left this slide kind of generic. And then similarly on the outbound side, if we have a trading partner that we need to hand off messages or files to, same thing. We have the ability to write to these storage containers via API with all the benefits of those tags and labels and metadata. So even though we didn't put a specific workflow up here, I feel like you can imagine what this would enable. You no longer need to have an API stood up on your engine or your API gateway that someone is calling into. You no longer are accessing some other vendor's API. It's really, we're just both hitting the same cloud storage account and exchanging messages that way. And that's applicable to a lot of cases where you might see FTP or other file methods in the past. So using APIs. I think quite capable.
That ends the workflow examples, but I think one of the things that came up during preparations and discussion, and even on our blurb about this webinar, was the common API nuances that come up so often. And I think, Caitlin, you were going to say a few things about that.
Yeah, and I think we touched on them throughout the presentation, but one of the biggest things we're thinking about API is security. And so one of the huge advantages that APIs have is we don't have to set up things like VPN tunnels that take an army on both sides to get going. But there are some things that we need to consider, both when we are calling out to APIs and when we are hosting them ourselves or hosting endpoints on our engines. And a lot of it is that authentication authorization is, authentication is essentially, hey, am I who I say I am? And then when we think of authorization, it's once I have access, what should I have access to? So, for example, if I'm calling, media patient portal, I can authenticate and say, hey, I'm Caitlin Formal, but I can't access Dan Sabo's data. And so we need to make sure that we are doing that on both sides. As we are thinking of, authenticating, how do I want to interact? Do I need to do that via tokens, via certificates? It's going to be OAuth, GWT. What do these interfaces require? And that can take some time to get set up. To be honest, I think both Dan and I have developed interfaces on both sides, and it's that's something that's it's not a VPN tunnel, but it can still take some time to get set. So that's something to consider. I think Dan also touched on some latency, and so when you're calling out to an external system, sorry, Dan, do you want to add something there?
Okay. I was just gonna add that right. I find that scoping an API a project, a lot of times you're given the JSON format. We didn't really talk about payloads too much in this, but very typically with REST APIs, we're dealing with either sending a JSON payload with our request where we're trying to create an object, or retrieving something and getting JSON back. So a lot of times we focus on what that format is, how we're going to map from our data format that we're starting with into the JSON, and when we get it back, how we're going to map it. And it's kind of easy to get caught up in those aspects. But don't forget to think about the authentication method, either that an API is requiring you to use, or that you will need to require if you're standing up an endpoint for proper security. I also, sometimes there are things that are not called out in the spec. So this custom headers item, you'll be following all of the instructions that their API website indicates, and yet still you're not having success. A lot of times you have to dig in and work with them and find out what is it that I'm not passing, and you'll find that it's a header that they just assumed everyone would pass, something of that nature.
Yeah, no, thank you, Dan.
Right. So, we spent a good bit of time even trying in our minds to summarize all the examples, all the things that Dan and Caitlin see in the field. And really, it's not an easy thing to summarize, but if we had to pick three things, this is probably could be the three as a good summarizations of how APIs help us. One, APIs can help us access the source of truth. We talked about that multiple times, and accessing that source of truth at the right time in real time. And it's so valuable, and we saw that with several examples that were given today. APIs can also enable new workflows that could really have not been done before, or at least not very easily. And so that those on-demand calls, they're ready to enrich and improve workflows across the continuum. And then finally, APIs can help tackle a diverse set of integration challenges. I thought it was really interesting as I watched these workflows that were put together that it's not all APIs, it's not all traditional HL7 usually, it's a hybrid mix of in between. And we really got a great professional services team, as you can tell, that can help you dig into that if you run into a snag, run into an issue, or just something you haven't seen before. We'd love to set up a conversation and even dig deep and help you with that. So as we begin to wind down, as we talk about and have talked about today, the growth of APIs and the flow of information, we at Rhapsody have considered heavily the need for security that we just talked about, especially external facing. But we're also focused in on the quality of data being exchanged. And we've addressed this with the Rhapsody interoperability suite. And it not only uses APIs in a number of different ways with all these takeaways that we've talked about, but it also helps ensure security of external endpoints with its API gateway, as you can see on this outer rim here. And through the integrate, identity, and semantic offerings, the interop suite can help you connect, classify, and clean your data to drive positive outcomes. Any other thoughts, Caitlin or Dan?
Yeah, we did have a question that I wanted to address. Someone asked, do we have any actual Rhapsody code that could be shared for building some of these? It will provide a template for future development. It's a great question because a lot of times that is all you need is a little bit of a start. So I know that I'm mostly focused on the core point side. The core point side has, and I'm sure Rhapsody as well, we have documentation and cookbook examples, but they aren't as good as being given an actual config. So there are various efforts that we're working with certain Salesforce examples. If anyone has the need to interact with Salesforce, we're working on getting those templates to you guys in a very consumable and easy way, rather than having to individually, someone ask for them. But for now, I would say reach out to your support or your professional services folks. And I'm sure that I know that we have examples that can certainly help along the way for a lot of specific APIs. But even having an example of a generic one written by someone in professional services, right, with all things kind of documented and properly laid out, even that can be a help for an API that we haven't, that's one that we haven't interacted with.
Excellent, thank you, Dan.
Yeah, I echo that. Definitely reach out to your account managers. These are all configurations, and all the examples that Dan and I spoke to are things that we've seen in the real world. So please reach out.
Yeah, and if you would, and I would say if there's any other questions, please add them in the chat now. We do have a few minutes, and we'll wait for a minute or so just to kind of let those collect in. And while we do, just to say, stay tuned for more on APIs. We know there's probably questions that haven't been answered today because we just don't have enough time to go over it. But stay tuned for more, and if you leave some feedback in the chat, we'll try to address that either in a one-on-one meeting or in our future content, future webinars. But already on our list is talking about APIs used for data enrichment and some of the things that may be available in the future. Some of the things that are already available, we can talk about that. The myriad of APIs that we have available in our own interop suite, semantic APIs, the MPI library of APIs that we'll discuss at a future date. Has there been any other questions in the chat? Okay, we do have one more. Does Rhapsody have any plan to construct an item in the toolbox that allows for generating JWTs instead of using the executable and having a custom build file on your Rhapsody servers?
So this is something, it actually relates. There's also another question, which is the API gateway in this diagram a separate product? Is it included in CorePoint? So they kind of are related, because sometimes doing work that can be involved in the engine is going to be something that's easier done in a gateway. So I don't know about the actual roadmap item to construct JWTs for. I assume you're talking about the Rhapsody engine. I don't have any information on that, but it is something that we look at our gateway product easing a lot of these workflows. So Dan, you may want to talk to the question about is it a separate product?
It is included with CorePoint and Rhapsody today. We would want to talk about some of the thresholds on the usage of the product out of the box per se. But yeah, that's probably a conversation we'll probably need to have with you. So if you don't mind, we'll send you some requests for maybe a discussion. Yeah, but certainly that is the idea. We know we need it. We know these mixed case scenarios come up, and we want to make not only that capability available to you, but also be able to basically handle any interoperability challenges thrown at you. So we may have one more coming in. Let's wait one moment. But as we start to close out, I would like to just thank thank all of you for joining. Thank you so much, Caitlin, for Dan, for sharing some of your expertise and getting our minds thinking about this topic. Yeah, and there are a few more questions coming in, but we'll follow up via email based on our time today. But thank you again, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Have a journey.